Thank you. Thank you. Now the next speaker, as I said earlier, is Nicholas Cowdery. Now, Nicholas Cowdery was the Director of Public Prosecution for the state of New South Wales, the largest prosecuting agency in Australia, and he was DPP from 1994 till 2011. Currently, he is a visiting professorial fellow at UNSW, an adjunct professor of law at the Sydney Institute of Criminology, University of Sydney, a visiting professorial fellow at Wollongong University, and an adjunct professor at Charles Sturt University. He is a legal expert consultant to the Commonwealth Secretariat, London, and is a consultant to the UN Office on Drugs and Crime on a joint international Association of Prosecutors project. He is also author of the book, Getting Justice Wrong, Myths, Media and Crime. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Nicholas Cowdery, the usual one.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's always a pleasure to listen to Alex talk about this, because it's an area of discourse in which he's been involved for a long time, even while he held very eminent medical positions in our community, and now it's his full-time occupation pretty much. And so he keeps very much abreast of what's happening internationally, of what the political scene is here in Australia, and you've had the benefit of his wisdom and advice delivered here this evening. This is politics in the pub. We're in the pub, there's no doubt about that. And this is politics. This issue is political. And that's why it's an eminently suitable topic for discussion in this forum. Because the answer to the kinds of problems that Alex has raised and talked about lies in the hands of our politicians. So, as he concluded with you, we all need to be sensitising our elected representatives to the need for change, just as it is happening in other countries around the world, again, as Alex has mentioned. Now, I'm going to bring the discussion a little bit more to Australia and to some of the reasons why we really do need to change. I'm sure you already have a broad idea of the arguments, but I just want to give some particular illustrations that are relevant to our own country, our own jurisdiction here in New South Wales. Did you know that under the criminal law of New South Wales, if you attempt to administer to yourself a prohibited drug, you commit an offence for which the maximum penalty is 2 years imprisonment. Now just think about that. Attempting, not even succeeding, to administer to yourself, not to somebody else, any prohibited drug, the maximum penalty that can be imposed is 2 years imprisonment. Now, it would be a pretty dopey magistrate who would impose a penalty of that kind. It's much more likely to be a good behaviour bond or perhaps a small fine if somebody is unlucky enough to be caught in that situation. But our legislators, the people who have made this legal regime to try to address the issue of drug use, have prescribed a penalty of that kind for that sort of conduct. And of course the penalties just go up from there. If other people are involved, if the quantities of drugs become larger, then the penalties go all the way up to life imprisonment. And we do have some prisoners in New South Wales, not many, but a few, who are serving life imprisonment for involvement in large quantities of illicit drugs. And when I say life imprisonment, I mean life meaning life. They will leave prison in a box. So our legislature, our elected representatives who make these laws, regard the issue of illicit drug use as so serious that the highest penalty that we have in our criminal law is able to be imposed on some people who are involved in this market. I want to give you just a few statistics. This is the only time that I'll do it, I promise. I'm not going to burden you with numbers, but I just want to give you a few figures to show the extent of illicit drug use in Australia. And this is a very well-credentialed global drug survey that is conducted at regular intervals of the whole of Australia. The latest survey was published in April of this year, so the figures are fairly current. It's a survey that was conducted on this occasion with 5,849 Australians chosen at random. 60% male, 40% female. The median age, 37. 84% of the people who were surveyed in employment. So, that's the sample that has been surveyed. And it was reported that in the last year, 97% of those people had taken alcohol. Perhaps not a very surprising statistic. 80% had taken an illegal drug. 80% of those people have taken an illegal drug in the last 12 months. Of the alcohol users, it's interesting to note that 51% reported potentially harmful use. This of a drug which is lawfully available, subject to controls and restrictions, subject importantly to tax, but nevertheless 51% had a problem with it. And 40% of the people who used alcohol said that they would like to drink less. Of the drug users, these are the 80% of the 5,849, 35% had used cannabis, 23% ecstasy, 20% cocaine, 12% amphetamines, 5% nitrous oxide, laughing gas.
Oh, yeah.
There you go. And 4.5%, that's 197 people, had snorted a white powder without knowing what it was. Of the drug users, 32% had used codeine, mostly to relax. Not for pain relief, but to relax. So that gives you a bit of a snapshot of what is actually going on around us. Maybe some people in this room responded to the survey, I don't know. But it gives you, I think, a pretty clear picture that notwithstanding the war on drugs, the regime of prohibition, there is a pretty high level of drug use in the community which looks unlikely to reduce over time. We have had, as Alex has mentioned, a war on drugs. Now, the war on drugs was a very cynical political exercise carried out by then President Richard Nixon of the United States of America. And we can even trace the beginning of the war on drugs to one day, the 17th of June 1971. And Nixon was in his re-election campaign. He wasn't doing so well. There are plenty here who would be old enough to remember what things were like in those days. And Vietnam had been a bit of a problem and so on. and he needed a political distraction, something that would grab the attention of the voters, form them in behind him, and allow him to lead us to the promised land. So on the 17th of June, we know this from his aides, the people who were working close to him, who have written books about these things. On the 17th of June 1971, he invented the war on drugs. And we have been fighting it now for, what, 43 years. And it has just been going from bad to worse the whole time. We have spent collectively billions of dollars of public money trying to enforce a regime of strict prohibition which, for the reasons Alex mentioned, can never succeed. Behind this is indeed a market. And I just want to take Alex's point and expand it a little bit, because it applies here just as much as it applies in other countries. So let me give you a few propositions about drugs. There have always been, and there will always be, drugs, substances that alter the mood and the mind when ingested, and may have physical effects as well. And there have always been, and there will always be, people who want to consume drugs, to alter their moods, for whatever reason. And there are many different reasons why people might choose to take up a drug, even a lawful one like alcohol or nicotine, or for that matter, caffeine. Some take drugs to relax, some to heighten their excitement, some take them to escape, some to engage with their peers. Some take them to aid in contented reflection, and on the other hand, some take them to help them rave in parties, pop concerts, and so on. Some deliberately choose to consume, some drift into it, perhaps through peer pressure or otherwise, and many become addicted. Now, this is supply and demand that we're talking about, so that's a market. And the important variable in that market is price, because we're talking about a market in substances that are illegal, and anybody involved with them commits a criminal offence. So that means that people who are involved run a risk of being detected and punished. And to compensate for that risk, they charge a higher price, a higher markup, a higher margin on the drugs that they obtain, and they then sell on to other people. They choose to run the risk because the profits, therefore, that can come from these dealings are enormous, huge. It's possible, for example, to buy heroin in Thailand somewhere, which might cost you $1,000, which can be sold here in Sydney without getting down to the street distributor for about $300,000. So it's and the figures will vary from time to time, depending on the supplies that are available and so forth. But it's that sort of markup, it's that sort of margin, if you are successful. So the incentives are very high for people who are prepared to break the law, to take a risk, to make huge amounts of money out of the use of drugs by ordinary people here in Australia. Those who consume the drugs run a risk too, because they also run the risk of being dealt with criminally for using the drugs and for passing them on amongst friends and so forth. But they take those risks because they have an urge for something that they can't get by any other means. So they're prepared to stick their necks out, prepared to run the risk and take their chances with the law. But because they have to pay the huge prices of the marketers, very often they're not able to obtain those resources lawfully. They haven't got the means, they haven't got the finances to fund their own use of drugs. And so they come looking for yours and for my assets to turn into money to purchase the drugs. So we have secondary crime being created by the market situation. And from time to time that can become a very high level of secondary crime, property crime, as Alex mentioned, people having their bags snatched in public places, people having houses broken into, cars broken into, and so forth. Consumers in this unregulated market don't benefit from market and product controls. Putting it very simply, when somebody goes out and scores drugs on the street or in a bar or wherever it happens to be, they haven't a clue what they have got. And there is no way of them knowing what they've got. They're taking an enormous risk. And very often they can get something that has been adulterated, something that can even kill them. And occasionally that has happened. So the whole underground nature of the market creates all these risks for everybody involved at all levels. The successful suppliers can sometimes reduce their risks by corrupting law enforcement. And we have certainly had plenty of examples over the years of police officers and customs officers being bribed to allow the trade to continue. And we've had royal commissions and commissions of inquiry that have uncovered these circles of influence. So in addition to secondary crime, the market is creating death and disease for the users and corruption of the law enforcement process. I'm still struggling to find where there is some community benefit to having this regime of prohibition in place. I don't think we've got any yet. So it's not something that we can say we haven't tested. This has been going on ever since those international instruments that Alex mentioned came into effect, ever since the war on drugs was declared in 1971, and right through the decades, whilst government after government after government in this country has adhered to a drug control plan of some kind, which by and large means throwing more and more money at law enforcement, trying to prevent the supply of drugs, while throwing very little funds at reducing the demand. Effective education and support of potential drug users, and trying to create an environment where the desire for drugs becomes less. We've just been throwing money at customs, at police, at all of the law enforcement initiatives that have been undertaken, and for what purpose? Oh fine, you see a big announcement on television. The police have just intercepted so many kilos of this or so many kilos of that. Fine, that's the tip of the iceberg. The tip of the iceberg. We have something, and my figures might be getting a little bit out of date now, but when I last looked at this, we have something like 2 million shipping containers brought into Australia every year. I think the number's probably higher now, but let's say it's 2 million. How many of those shipping containers are examined when they hit our shores? It's in the low thousands. And that's the way that most of the large supplies of drugs and precursors for drug manufacture come into the country. They might be disguised in statues or some other items inside the shipping containers, but they come in the shipping containers. The airport bust of some courier with a corset full of heroin or something like that is becoming very rare. The crooks don't need to do that sort of thing. They're bringing the stuff in container loads. Well, we've had this regime in place for a very long time. What have been the effects? Now, what I'm going to tell you is information that has been verified very carefully by agencies who make a specialty of examining these kinds of things. And I'm going to put a number of propositions to you. The results of the war on drugs include this. And I'm speaking internationally, including Australia. The production of drugs has increased. Drug consumption has increased steadily over time. The number of types of drugs available, as Alex mentioned, has increased enormously. And indeed, as drugs, specific drugs with specific effects are put onto the banned list, some clever little chemist somewhere invents a new one that has a slightly different molecular structure and therefore is not caught by that definition and makes a bit of money while that's able to be sold. And they just move on from drug to drug to drug to drug. And while the demand is there, while the profit is there, there's never going to be an end to that sort of inventiveness. The purity of the drugs available has increased. So it's not a matter of more diluted stuff coming in. The purity has gone up progressively over time as well. And drugs have become more difficult to obtain, easier to obtain. All kinds of drugs. Easier to obtain now by people who are intent on getting them than they were 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30, 40 years ago. And the price. Well, notwithstanding the huge profits commanded by the suppliers, the prices of drugs have actually fallen. And quite substantially. And continue to fall. Because there are economies of scale that the suppliers can exploit, and they can turn over huge quantities and reduce their margins a little bit to encourage the demand. Now, I don't call that a successful policy campaign, the war on drugs. And I don't think any rational person could. We've really gone from bad to worse. And I think that the only way out of this, as Alex has illustrated in other countries, is to bite the bullet. But it needs a politician with some teeth to do it. And that's, no politician is going to act unless he or she can be comfortable that the community will support him or her. This is an issue where politicians famously do not stick their necks out, although in some other countries that is happening. But here in Australia it's regarded as too politically risky. If any politician speaks in favour of regulating drugs, there's going to be a political backlash, or so the feeling is. Now, we as voters, as citizens, need to convince our elected representatives that that's not the case. That there is a better way, a more sensible way, a rational way of dealing with these drugs, and we want to see some movement towards that happening. And what it involves is legislating to legalise drugs. Now, there'll be different regimes for different drugs because they have different effects, they're produced in different ways, they're used by different sections in the community. But that's all right, that can all be tailored to the particular drug. We need then to regulate the manufacture or the production of drugs and their distribution. And the beauty of it is, as Colorado has discovered and Washington State is about to discover, you can tax this. And you can get quite substantial tax revenue from a legal, properly controlled market in the drugs that people want to buy. And that additional tax money, if you like, can be spent in programs that will help drug addicts and perhaps persuade people not to use drugs. Or at least people who are not presently making considered and sensible decisions to do so. Now, I'm not advocating that everybody should use drugs. But what I'm saying is that there is a certain proportion of the community that will continue to use drugs. And I believe that government has a responsibility to try to ensure the health and safety of those people. And the only way that can be done, in my belief, is by regulating, controlling and taxing the supply of drugs and making them available in ways that have been tried and tested in other jurisdictions around the world. I'll put in a little plug here for an organisation that I know Alex is very closely involved in, Australia 21. Has anybody heard of Australia 21? Yes, there are a few nods and a few shakes. They have a website, and Alex and I were both involved in one of their projects, which resulted in the publication of 2 reports. The first was the Prohibition of illicit drugs is killing and criminalising our children, and we are letting it happen. That was the first report. And then later, last year?
Same year, 2012.
2012, year before last, these happened. The second report was Alternatives to Prohibition. Illicit drugs, how we can stop killing and criminalising young Australians. Now, I'm not going through those reports with you. They're available on the Australia 21 website. You will see that putting Alex and me to one side, the group concerned in this particular inquiry were not a bunch of left-leaning potheads. They're actually quite responsible citizens, like Alex and me. There are some very good ideas in those reports for the way forward from very eminent people who know what they're talking about. So I think, let me just leave you with this thought. We as citizens, we as voters, have an obligation to exercise our democratic rights in a responsible way. And I think so far as drugs are concerned, we've reached the point where we just cannot allow the drift to continue and the waste to continue. We need to be more positive, we need to be more active, we need to change direction. And it's only when you and I and all the voters send that signal to the politicians that we'll have change. So good luck.